Thank you, Ryan. President Asperger, members of the board, residents of the Grange. My name is Eric Russell, and I'm very happy to be here with you tonight to talk about the three studies that we most recently performed. We're going to get right into the study of the conversion of 47th Street to the three-lane configuration. Again, this is in a preliminary form, the study now. And we're just presenting the results for the first time, and we're very anxious to get some feedback from the board as well as residents. I think Bob did a very nice summary on the background of the study, so I'm not going to bother going into it here, but it did come out of the speed study along the recommendation for the reduction of the roadway in width. Just to look at the study area.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure everybody can hear in the back. I'm not sure it's on. It didn't sound to me either like you had you hooked up.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
Everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. To go over the purpose of the three-lane study, really is to study the potential to redesign the roadway, to reconfigure it from 4 lanes to 3 lanes. And the aerial here, it's a little hard to see with the lighting. I don't know if you want to dim the lighting at all. Might make it easier to see all of the slides. But the extension of the study extended across the full length of the village from East Avenue here, on the east end of the village, across to Gilbert Avenue on the west end of the village. It's a distance of about 1.5 miles. This is just an aerial view up on the top slide here of what 47th Street looks like today. This is at Gilbert Avenue on the west end. You can see that 47th Street over at Gilbert is what we call a 5-lane roadway. It's 2 lanes in each direction, eastbound and westbound, and there's a center lane for left turning movements. And then as the roadway continues to the east, it tapers down to a 4-lane section, much like what you see down here in front of the park, Marilla Park. Again, it's hard to see, but there's a 4-lane roadway. There's 2 lanes in each direction. The car here being in the center lane. And the way the 4-lane roadway tends to work when there's no turn lane, there's no median in the center, is that speeds can vary between the lanes. Typically, the inside lane closest to the center is a little faster. Cars travel a little faster. The curb lane tends to be a little slower. So cars are traveling at different speeds going in the same direction in some cases. There's no turn lanes, as you can see, so if a car wants to make a left turn, that car will slow down, the car behind it has to slow down, or that car behind it might bypass that car and go around. So there's lane changing that takes place on a 4-lane roadway. The same if a car is making a right turn. That car making a right turn will slow down, the car behind it will either do the same, or it'll change lanes. You have lane changes from the other direction. So you have some lane changes occurring both in the left and the right direction. Talk a little bit about the need along 47th Street in particular. I think what our speed study showed was despite the reduction in the speed limit from 35 miles an hour to 30 miles per hour back at the end of 2009, the average speeds, the 85th percentile speeds on 47th Street remained high. They remain higher than what a 30-mile-an-hour roadway should carry. The average speeds were around 33 miles per hour. The 85th percentile speeds were over 38 miles per hour. And the 85th percentile speed is the speed at which 85% of traffic or less is traveling. So the vast majority of traffic is traveling up to 38 miles per hour on 47th Street. What else relates to the need? Well, the adjacency of the land uses that adjoin 47th Street. There's parks, there's Marilla Park, there's a church, there's a school, and there's residential areas for most of the length of 47th Street. And the village continues to hear concerns about residents about safety related to crossing 47th Street and the lack of comfort in crossing 47th Street, despite the improvements that have been made at 9th Avenue. So if we look at some of the objectives of the study, the 3-lane study, it's really to determine if a lane reduction, as it's called, can occur while still maintaining quality levels of service on the roadway. Make sure the roadway can operate at the same high level as it does today. We want to make sure that the impacts are minimized to any adjoining streets, any adjoining neighborhoods, so traffic doesn't divert off of 47th Street and cut through neighborhoods or use other streets, either in the Grange or other communities. And the last point being, we want to achieve some traffic calming benefits, increases in pedestrian safety, and better link the north end of the community, north of 47th Street, with the south side of the community, south of 47th Street. So we have a near-term strategy with the study. And that's to attempt to develop a cost-effective redesign for the roadway that can be implemented within the existing curb dimensions of the roadway. That's what makes it cost-effective. Without changing curb lines, can we achieve the objectives of the study in this near-term strategy? As Bob had mentioned, there's a longer-term potential strategy, and that is one day the village may acquire the roadway from IDOT for a jurisdictional transfer, and that would give the village much more control over the roadway to do what they like. But again, that would require the reconstruction of the roadway to occur before the transfer was in place, relocation of the curbs, bringing them in, making the road permanently narrower, and at a much higher cost than what we'll talk about this evening. But it's unknown at this time when the village, when IDOT would have the funds available to make such a substantial investment. So the focus of the study tonight is on the near-term strategy, and what we can do within the curb-to-curb dimension of the roadway. Talk a little bit about typical candidate roadway for a lane reduction. Typical candidate roadway is a 4-lane roadway that's been converted in other case studies around the country. It carries around 12,000, 18,000 vehicles per day. 47th Street is right within that range, depending on whether you're east or west of the Grange Road. Candidate Street carries less than 1,500 vehicles in a particular lane over the course of an hour. The Grange Road, 47th Street today is carrying 425 vehicles in each lane. So if 2 lanes in one direction are combined into a single lane, you'd have about 850 cars. Again, well under the threshold of what is considered for a typical candidate type of roadway for a lane reduction. And there's many advantages to the lane reduction, and there's a few disadvantages. I think it's important that we go through these. With respect to advantages, you have a narrower roadway when you go from 4 lanes to 3, obviously, but it creates a calmer traffic environment. You tend to have more travel speeds because rather than having 2 lanes in each direction, each lane carrying different speeds, there's only a single lane. And the lead car in a platoon of vehicles kind of sets the speed. So if that car is traveling closer to the speed limit, all the cars behind them also have to follow at a similar speed limit. You don't have the ability for passing or bypassing cars in an adjacent lane. But the case studies have shown that the reductions in travel speeds have occurred, but to a small degree, not substantial reductions. But it's important to know that whether it's a 4-lane roadway or it's a 3-lane roadway, speeds are comparable, a little lower with the 3-lane roadway. Levels of service, case studies have shown, remain at very similar levels to what you had with the 4-lane roadway. So there isn't a reduction in operating conditions necessarily if the right type of roadway is reduced. If you take a roadway that's carrying 40,000 vehicles per day and you try and reduce it to 3 lanes, it's not going to operate well. But if the vehicles on the roadway, the volumes, are within that range of a good candidate street, it can function very well as a 3-lane roadway. A 3-lane roadway does create a more comfortable environment for pedestrians. There's fewer lanes to cross, as an example. Since the speeds are more uniform, there's not that fluctuation in speeds. It tends to be more predictable to a pedestrian. When they see a single lane of cars coming toward them, it's a little easier to judge when it's appropriate to cross than if cars are approaching at different speeds, especially in evening conditions or inclement weather. You tend to have a reduction in the number and the severity of accidents with a 3-lane roadway. You don't have cars stopping in a through lane to make a left turn, for instance. So you would have a reduction in typical types of collisions that occur in that scenario, like rear-end type crashes. We have a dedicated left turn lane, a center lane with a 3-lane roadway. So the turning accidents are reduced because you have a dedicated space for that type of vehicle. Because the traffic flow is more uniform, the speeds are more uniform, you have less excessive speeding. So you have less accidents that occur from cars speeding or cars changing lanes. You get a lot of sideswipe type of accidents when cars are changing lanes or moving into one lane. Those types of accidents are reduced with a 3-lane roadway. There's advantages as far as sight distance goes. If you're in a car in a side street, for instance, and you're looking to turn on to 47th Street, as a 4-lane roadway, sometimes your view of one lane or another might be blocked by a car in an adjacent lane. With a 3-lane roadway, you don't have cars side by side blocking the view of various motorists. So the sight lines are improved, whether you're driving down 47, or you're a pedestrian looking across 47, or you're a motorist on a cross street looking to enter 47. The roadway becomes more multimodal. If you keep the curb lanes where they are and you reduce the number of lanes, then you have excess space in the roadway. And typically that excess space is used for a bicycle lane or a parking lane or something of the like. And in our study, we suggest making use of that excess space for a 5-foot bike lane on each side of the roadway. And so the roadway becomes more multimodal than the economy bikes. It's a cost-effective solution. It requires restriping of the roadway. There's some modifications to the traffic signals that are required, but it doesn't require a wholesale reconstruction of the roadway, so it can be a very cost-effective type of change. And the last point there related to just overall improvement in the quality of life for the residents of the area. With increased pedestrian safety, slower speeds, more uniform travel speeds, it makes for better living conditions. There are some disadvantages. To a slight degree, the travel times will increase. Speeds will be a little lower. The travelers will go at more uniform speeds, and so consequently, the travel time if you're going across the entire corridor would be a little higher. In most cases, the residents of the area are more than willing to accept that if the roadway is a safer roadway and it's more comfortable to negotiate. There are some increased delays that you could expect if you were a motorist trying to turn from the cross streets, because there's only a lane in each direction, and that single lane is going to carry more traffic than 2 lanes in each direction would. It takes a little more time to find an adequate gap to turn onto the roadway. Third point there, lack of passing opportunities. Again, if you're behind a car looking a little slower, then you have to travel at that same speed. You won't have the ability to pass that vehicle. And the last point there is a potential for diversions of traffic. Depends on the type of roadways, depends on the type of street system that runs parallel to the roadway that's being converted. But there's always a potential the traffic could divert off for one reason or another if it's determined that they can get somewhere faster by using another roadway than the roadway that was converted. Let's focus a little bit on 47th Street specifically. First off, it's an important roadway in the village of the Grange. There's only 3 east-west arterial roadways in the village: Ogden Avenue, 47th Street, and 55th. Ogden being about a mile to the north and 55th about a mile to the south. 47th Street really serves the center part of the village. So it serves an important function as an arterial. It is under IDOT jurisdiction today. It's part of the National Highway System. As I mentioned, it's carrying around 14,000 to 16,000 vehicles per day. It doesn't carry a lot of truck traffic. Less than 2% of the traffic is trucks on 47. We mentioned the speed limit today is at 30 miles an hour. There's 4 traffic signals along the extent of the village: the Grange Road, Brainerd, Edgewood, and Gilbert. There's an enhanced crosswalk at 9th Avenue that everyone is familiar with that was recently installed. There are no bicycle accommodations on the roadway today. No specific lanes or anything, but it is an unmarked roadway under IDOT's bikeway maps. It's an unmarked roadway for biking with caution advised. That's how it's described on IDOT's bicycling maps. And the Active Transportation Alliance has their own set of maps, and they indicate that 47th Street is a recommended on-street bike route. So today the way the roadway functions, it's called a shared roadway if you were to use it for bicycling. And the roadway is shared with bicyclists, but it's a very narrow roadway for that. I don't know how many people are comfortable or would be comfortable riding the bike on 47th Street, how it exists today. But it's important to note that it is identified in some mapping from the state as a recommended on-street route. There's no parking on 47th Street today, no provisions for that. We talked about the adjacent land uses. A little information here on crash history. This is for the 5-year period between 2004 and 2008. On average, 87 crashes per year. About 35% of those occurred either at the Grange Road intersection or the East Avenue intersection. The remainder of those occurred at some stretch of 47th Street in between. And of those 87 crashes, there was 1 fatality and 127 injuries. Last point there's no public transportation that currently operates along 47th Street. This is a cross-section of what the roadway looks like today. Again, not at the intersection of the Grange Road where there are left turn lanes, but for most of the sections in between the signal-controlled intersections. You have 4 lanes, they're each 10.5 feet wide. Curb and gutter, parkway on each side of the street that ranges from 9 to 11 feet. And there's a sidewalk on each side of the road within that parkway. The proposal with the lane reduction, there's 2 pictures to look at, but it's the same design. Look up here would be to create a 3-lane roadway. That's an eastbound lane, a westbound lane, and at intersections, the center median would serve left turn movements. So there's your 3 lanes. And then with the extra 5 feet on each side of the roadway, we create a bike lane. And this would be a striped bike lane with bike symbols on the pavement and a line between the roadway and the bike lane. And the parkway would be the same. If you look at the lower picture here, this is a location mid-block where there's not a left turn lane. It would just be a painted median, 1 lane in each direction. This is a local area example. This is over in North Riverside on 26th Street. They had a 4-lane roadway, very much like the 47th Street looks like today. There's no median, there's no turn lanes, it's just 2 lanes in each direction. They converted the roadway to a 3-lane. And you can see they have a continuous center left turn lane, 1 lane in each direction. They didn't have the space to create a bike lane, so they really just have some extra space, a couple extra feet along the curb. But a very similar configuration to what we're talking about on 47th Street. We did an analysis of a lot of traffic operations under a 4-lane scenario, under a 3-lane scenario, for the morning peak hour, for the evening rush hour, and all of the signalized intersections as well as at East Avenue. And if you compare the columns between a 4-lane and 3-lane, you can see the levels of service don't really change at the signalized intersections, which means that the volumes are such and the intersections can operate at a very similar level. Now again, I should mention at Gilbert Avenue and on Grange Road, we would not be reducing the roadway. We would keep the 5-lane configuration. It's only with the sections in between that we reduce the roadway. And the reason we have to keep the 5-lane sections, those intersections, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, the Grange Road, there's a much higher volume than 47th Street. And the amount of time that needs to be given to the Grange Road shared with the time given to 47th Street, there's not adequate capacity at that intersection in order to reduce the capacity of 47th Street. So the roadway at that intersection would remain as you see it today. But as you go east and west of the Grange Road on 47th Street, that's where the roadway would taper down. Over at Gilbert Avenue, in the westbound direction, as you approach the intersection, we maintain the 2 lanes heading westbound. So as you enter into Western Springs, you just continue as a 4-lane roadway. So we haven't reduced the roadway in the westbound direction as you approach Gilbert Avenue. At Brainerd and at Edgewood, that would be a full 3-lane section through those signals. And you can see the intersections, operations don't change. Down at East Avenue, again, we haven't changed the configuration of the roadway. With the volume of train activity, with the time that the gates are down, with the stacking that occurs today, with those grade crossings, there'd be no way to reduce the roadway without creating much, much longer queues. So we're keeping the 4-lane, 5-lane with the turn lane cross section that intersection as well, in order to clear the intersection out quicker than the Gate Street network. If the intersection is signalized, and we'll talk about this a little later, that's what this asterisk down here. The level of service would be remarkably improved at the intersection with the signal. Whether it's in its current configuration further to the west as a 5-lane, 4-lane roadway, or as a 3-lane roadway is proposed. So in any case, the level of service is improved at East Avenue with the signal.
I'm sorry, before you go off of that, may I ask a question?
Sure.
You determined the changes to service levels from 4-lane to 3-lane. How? Did you actually restrict the lanes and then measure the impacts in that fashion?
We modeled it in our analysis programs. We were able to model the existing conditions and get them the model to show, replicate what actually takes place today. And then we reduce the capacity of the roadway with the same volumes, adjust the traffic signal controls as necessary in order to determine how the intersection would operate as a 3-lane.
Okay, thank you.
Talk a little bit about the potential for traffic diversions. We don't expect the diversions to be significant on 47th Street for a number of reasons. But just as an overview, if you look at the case studies that are out there for the roadways that have been converted around the country, typically volumes have changed on those roadways from anywhere from a reduction of 10% up to an increase of 15%. So they've gone both ways. And in many cases, the volumes really didn't change on those roadways, despite the fact that they were reduced from 4 lanes to 3. So every situation is a little different. The reason we don't expect that the volumes will change significantly on 47th Street are listed up here. There's many reasons. If you look at from an arterial perspective, again, arterials have the highest capacity of the roadways. There's only 2 again in the village. Ogden and 55th, they're as far as a mile away to the north and to the south. They're carrying volumes of traffic that are higher than 47th Street does today. They're more congested. They have similar speed limits. So for a car to think that there's time savings by using the other arterials, they'd be going out of their way by a mile, and they would be using a roadway that's more congested than 47th Street. So that's probably not likely to happen. If you look at the collector roadways that parallel 47th Street, Plainfield Road and Cossett Avenue, they're each about a half mile to the north and to the south. For the most part, both those roadways are 2-lane roadways. There's some left turn lanes on Plainfield Road today. Cossett Avenue is a 2-lane roadway throughout. There's speed zones along those roadways, multiple stop signs along Cossett. So the likelihood that a motorist would want to deviate off onto those streets to gain travel time as opposed to just staying on 47th Street as a 3-lane design, we also don't think is likely to happen. And then closest to 47th Street, if you look at the local street system, here again, you think if someone is trying to use the most direct route to 47th Street, they might just use the next street over from 47. But most of the local streets in the Grange are not continuous across the entire length of the village like 47th Street is. All of the local streets are 2-lane design, about 25 miles per hour. There's stop signs every 2 to 3 blocks. So by no means would there be time savings for a motorist to want to deviate off of 47th Street and use one of the local neighborhood streets instead. And that's the gist of the last point here, that there really isn't a time savings. From our perspective, our opinion is that most motorists would remain on 47th Street, whether it remains in its 4-lane configuration or it's converted to 3 lanes. Just some preliminary costs. As everyone knows, 47th Street was just resurfaced by IDOT. It looks very nice to them. To be able to modify the roadway to a 3-lane configuration, you would have to remove all the pavement markings. You'd have to do some reconfiguration of the traffic signal heads to realign them, and some other ancillary work. Typically, when pavement markings are removed, they're ground off the surface, and the ground pavement relieves the scarring of the pavement. And so In most cases, when pavement markings are removed, the roadway is resurfaced. And Tom here estimated the cost a couple of years back of about $2.5 million if the roadway was to be resurfaced again, in this case, in order to create the lane markings. We looked at a possibility, just very preliminarily here, of if the markings can be removed by some method without scarring the pavement, through methods such as water blasting, and then restriping the roadway and modifying the traffic signals. If it can be done, if a contractor can do that work, it would be a much lower cost.
Can I just jump into what?
Yeah.
You say if it can be done. Has it been done in other localities?
The technique's been done in other states. I'm not familiar enough yet if it's been done in this area. We need to do some research on that. There's a lot of research out there, and the case studies have shown that it's been effective at removing pavement markings without scarring the surface. And so we would need to research that if that's the direction of the board to look into that, to get down to this lower cost. And this is just information purposes here. If there was a jurisdictional transfer and the roadway would be completely reconstructed, the curb lines brought into a permanent 3-lane design, Grange Associates estimated the cost of about $11.5 million. Again, that includes signalization work. It actually included new water main along 47th Street, streetscaping work, new lighting, new curbing and drainage, full reconstruction of the roadway. So what are our findings, our conclusions here? Well, from all of the information in the study, it does appear that 47th Street would make a very attractive candidate for a conversion to a 3-lane roadway. The geometric conditions are sufficient. The roadway can be converted with simple striping, with the curb lanes remaining in their current place. The traffic volumes, as we talked about, are in the acceptable range for a typical street that makes for a good candidate. Intersections would continue to operate at very similar levels of service and acceptable levels of service by IDOT standards. Do we achieve the objectives of the study that we set out in the beginning? The level of service is maintained. Yes, we achieved that objective. We're not expecting any significant diversions of traffic off of the roadway simply because it's reduced to a 3-lane roadway. So that would achieve that objective. We do think there would be some traffic calming benefits. The fact that there would be more uniform traffic flows, the speeds would be a little lower, a little more predictable, fewer lane changes, would be a calmer traffic environment for sure. Pedestrian safety would be improved. It's a narrower roadway, there's fewer lanes to cross. The speeds are more predictable, might be a more comfortable environment for people to cross the roadway. And it's more comfortable and with the creation of the bike lanes and comfort level of the pedestrians crossing the roadway, it does help improve the connectivity of the community from the south and north ends of the village. And with that, I'm going to give the voting over to Brian, who can talk about the next steps of the study. Do you want to do that, Joe? Okay.